Hello everyone. Welcome to this brand new session on SAML authentication. If you guys haven't heard about this tool, then don't worry. With this session, you are going to learn all the intricacies of this authentication tool. But before we begin, make sure to follow our Intellipaat YouTube channel and hit that bell icon so that you never miss any technical update from us. First of all, we shall discover the agenda for this session. We'll begin this session by understanding what SAML authentication is. Then we'll try to contemplate why SAML authentication was developed in the first place and why it's useful. And finally, we'll take a deep dive to understand how SAML works. I hope I have made myself clear with the agenda.
So without any further ado, let's get started with our first topic, what is SAML. We'll try to contemplate this concept with the help of simple illustration before we go into any technical jargon. This is Alex. Recently, he had joined a well-established IT corporation as a software developer, and after the induction session, he received the ID card, a desk, official email address, and the access to the dashboard. Once Alex signed into the dashboard, he was presented with the icons of all the external services the company uses, such as Salesforce, Microsoft 365, Jira, AWS, and many more. Alex clicked on the Salesforce icon and some magic happened in the background. Before Alex knew it, he was signed in into the Salesforce without even inputting any passwords or filling out any login forms. Now the question here is what magic happened in this example and how it happened, right? Well, this is no biggie. The answer is it was SAML in action. It is what that magical force is which is driving Alex to log in into any service without any insertion of credentials. So guys, basically SAML is an acronym that stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It is an open standard XML based protocol for exchanging identity data between two parties. What are those two parties? Well, they are identity provider and service provider. The identity provider is the party that is going to verify the client in order to provide the software access, whereas service provider is the party which is responsible for providing those accesses once the client is verified by the IDP or identity provider. Now, in the context of our illustration, the IDP will be an automated authorization tool such as Auth0. Alex will be the client who requires access to the Salesforce software, and Salesforce here will be the service provider. Alright. So basically, when an employee of Alex organization signs into the dashboard, they do so with Auth0. When employee clicks on the Salesforce icon, Salesforce detects that the user wants to log in via SAML. Salesforce sends an employee back to Auth0 with a SAML request that asks Auth0 to authenticate the user. Since the employee has already authenticated with Auth0, Auth0 verifies the session and sends the user back to Salesforce with SAML response. Salesforce checks this response and if it is good, then employee is granted with access. If this is not clear to you guys, don't worry. We'll understand how it works with the use case, but before that, let's understand why SAML is important and why it was developed. Imagine the example of Alex again. In this case, his office doesn't have SAML working in the background. So in order to access any cloud software, Alex will have different credentials and user IDs. The same thing will hold true for Alex's whole team, right? Here, let's say Alex wants to access multiple softwares at a time. Now, each software will have their own credential databases to verify Alex or any employee of his firm, right? Now suppose if he wants to access 15 different softwares, he'll have to remember 15 different IDs and passwords as well, right? Which is a difficult task in itself. Imagine the management overload as a whole when multiple fragments are utilized to develop a single product. Doesn't it sound like headache from that perspective? It does, right? That's the reason why this assertion protocol was developed in the first place. And it really does help in keeping track of softwares as well as to maintain the security. Having said that, let's understand how SAML works. Now that you have seen the high-level overview of how SAML authentication works, let's look at some of the technical details to sort of gain insight into how everything is accomplished. Consider this three-party setup containing user or client, identity provider and service provider. If a client wants to access the service of service provider, he must first authenticate into the IDP. If the user manages to successfully authenticate and is authorized, then the IDP generates a SAML assertion. The assertion is then sent to the application, and since the user is already authenticated into the IDP, the user can single sign on into other applications. Let's go one step deeper into SAML flow. The identity provider knows about your user and their attributes. Furthermore, the service provider has its own knowledge about the user. When the identity provider generates an assertion, along the way, IDP populates it with a user identifier and sends it over to the service provider. But we cannot just send this assertion in clear text, completely unprotected, right? So, the IDP must first encrypt the text or add an unique signature over it. This way, service provider can validate the issuer of the assertion and thereby trust it. Next, when SP reads the user identifier and tries to map it to a user in its own database or user store, there is possibility of an assertion failure because the username in SP's database might differ from the IDP, right? Hence, for this federation to work, the SP needs to detect what user identifier format should be there. For example, the SP should tell the IDP that it wants an email address as a user identifier, right? Now, IDP will have to respond back with the email ID as user identifier, and now since both sides have the same configuration, the SAML assertion can be mapped to a user object as the service provider, and thereby the service provider can allow user with access since the assertion of SAML federation is achieved. The configuration or rules for integration are critical to successfully establish a SAML federation. These configurations can be entered manually into your service provider or identity provider, but often you collect the requirements and capabilities into an XML metadata file in order to share them. This file contains the requirements and capabilities into an XML metadata file. This file also contains setting and the certificate of system. Now, once you exchange this file, the SAML federation gets executed. This metadata exchange is what establishes the trust between these entities for authentication and access provisioning. I hope this phenomena of SAML protocol is clear to all of you guys out there. That's all we have for this session. I hope this session was informative and interesting. If you have liked this session, a thumbs up to this video will be phenomenal and enticing. Also, if you have any queries about the content covered in this session, please drop them in the comment box below, and our 24/7 team of experts will be delighted to resolve all of them. Until next time, I wish you all the best in exploring the world of digital technologies.